The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable, familiar kind of silence, the type that settles over a sleeping world or lingers in the aftermath of a storm. No, this was the kind of silence that had weight, a tangible pressure that squeezed the breath from lungs and made even the most battle-hardened warriors hesitate. Commander Sharin stood at the edge of the anomaly, his 3 hearts beating in an uneven rhythm as he stared into the void before him. The dead zone, a place where logic failed, where sensors returned nonsense, and where entire scouting teams had disappeared without a trace. And yet, something was moving inside it. Sharin's mandibles clicked in agitation as his second-in-command Vralek adjusted the scanning module. "Sir, I don't understand. There's life inside the anomaly." "Impossible. Confirmed. Biometric readings. Bipedal. Oxygen-based." Sharin's secondary set of eyes narrowed. That was even more impossible. Oxygen-based life was fragile. The dead zone had no oxygen, no atmosphere, no magnetic shielding. It was an open wound in space, an abyss where even the laws of physics seemed to break down. Nothing should have been able to survive in there. Nothing, except whatever, was walking toward them now. A shape emerged from the swirling dark, outlined against the distortion field. It was humanoid. Broad-shouldered, upright, moving with deliberate, unhurried steps, not stumbling, not gasping for air, not succumbing to the lethal conditions of the anomaly. It walked as if it belonged there, as if it had never left. Sharin's. Claws tensed on the grip of his plasma rifle, his warriors already raising their weapons, mandibles clicking out warnings in hushed tones. And then the thing smiled, not a grimace of pain. Not the final expression of something on the verge of death, no. This was something else entirely. The human lifted a gloved hand as if greeting old friends and spoke. His voice crackled through the comms, clear, calm, and far too confident. For someone standing alone in the most inhospitable place in the sector, "Welcome to my home." Commander Sharin did not lower his weapon. Neither did his soldiers. The human, if it was a human, stood just beyond the shifting veil of the dead zone, completely at ease in an environment that should have liquefied his insides. The distortion field crackled behind him, twisting the light around its edges, an ever-hungry abyss waiting to consume anything foolish enough to linger. Yet the human remained. His armor was worn but functional, scarred in ways that told stories of countless battles. A long rifle rested against his back, secured by thick straps, but he made no move toward it. He didn't need to. His confidence was a weapon all its own. "Identify yourself," Sharin growled, his voice cutting through the static interference. The human tilted his head slightly, amused. "You're the ones on my doorstep. Shouldn't you introduce yourselves first?" Vralek stiffened beside his commander. "This sector is under quarantine by order of the Galactic Concord. State your designation and how you survived exposure to the dead zone." The humans sighed, as if they were children asking obvious questions. "I was born here." A ripple passed through Sharin's squad. His warriors weren't easily shaken, but that statement unsettled them more than any weapon could have. "That's not possible," Sharin said, keeping his tone even. "No one lives in the dead zone. No one survives exposure long enough to—" The human raised a hand, cutting him off with an easy, almost lazy motion. "You call it the dead zone. But to me, it's just home." His voice was steady, unbothered. No bravado, no desperation, just a simple, undeniable fact. And that was what made it terrifying. Sharin flicked his mandibles in frustration. He had studied humans, fought against them, even respected their tenacity in a reluctant sort of way. But this one didn't act like the survivors he had seen, clawing their way out of war zones or drifting through wrecked colonies. He acted like someone who belonged in this impossible place. Sharin gave a subtle hand signal, and Vralek immediately relayed a private frequency scan back to their warship. He wanted full biological analysis, sensor sweeps, anything that could tell him how this was possible. The human just stood there, waiting. "Your ship," Sharon pressed, choosing a different angle. "How did you arrive? There are no safe hyperlanes through this sector." Another slow smile. "I didn't arrive. I never left. The air itself seemed to tighten." Vralik took a half-step back. His eyes flicked to the shifting, flickering horizon of the dead zone, then back to the human. "What are you?" That was the right question. The human smile faded just a fraction. Not a threat, something else, something deeper. A shift in the weight of the conversation. "You're the first to make it this far," he said, voice quiet but carrying. "You think the dead zone is a mistake, an anomaly?" Sharon's clawed fingers curled against his rifle grip. The human's gaze sharpened. "You have no idea what this place really is." A low tremor rolled through the air, deep and distant, like the heartbeat of something ancient waking from slumber, something inside the dead zone. Sharon had made a critical mistake. He hadn't just found a survivor. He had found a gatekeeper, and the door behind him was starting to open. A warning tone blared in Sharon's earpiece. Sharp, urgent, and full of static corruption. "Commander, sensors are—" The transmission garbled into a mess of distorted noise before cutting out completely. Vralik cursed under his breath, tapping his comms. "We've lost connection to the ship." Sharon didn't respond. His attention was locked on the anomaly behind the human. The air around it shimmered. Not the way heat distorts a landscape, but in a way that felt wrong, as if space itself was shifting, rewriting its own existence. The human turned slightly, glancing back at the distortion. He wasn't concerned. He was expecting this. Sharon's instincts screamed at him to retreat. They were deep in enemy territory, not human territory, not even Dominion space, but something else. A place that had swallowed fleets, fractured reality, and left nothing but silence in its wake. And this human was standing on its threshold, calm as the void. Sharon had commanded war campaigns, led troops into the blackest pits of conflict. He had seen planets burn, watched entire species fight for their final breath, and yet he had never felt hunted like this. The human finally spoke. "You should leave." The words weren't a threat, they were a warning. Vralik's mandibles tensed. "You think you can intimidate us, human?" A dry chuckle. "No, I think you don't understand what you're standing next to." A gust of wind, impossible in the vacuum of this dead world, brushed past them. It carried whispers, not voices, not words, but impressions. Distant echoes of something vast and unknowable. The anomaly moved. Sharon didn't see it change. There was no transition, no distortion wave, but suddenly it was closer. The event horizon, once several meters away, now loomed just behind the human's shadow. A tide of unease rolled through Sharon's forces. They were warriors, trained killers, veterans of campaigns that had broken entire empires. And yet, at this moment, Sharon knew with chilling certainty they were out of their depth. Vralik raised his weapon instinctively, but the human just sighed. "You came looking for answers," he said. "But this place doesn't give them freely." Sharon forced his voice to remain steady. "What is it?" The human didn't answer right away. He studied them, as if weighing their worth, deciding whether they deserved the truth. Then, finally, "A door." Sharon's grip on his rifle tightened. "A door to what?" The human's expression darkened to something that should have stayed closed. Behind him, the anomaly pulsed like a great lung inhaling, and for the first time since setting foot here, Sharon truly understood. They were not alone. Something inside the dead zone had woken up, and it was looking right at them. The anomaly breathed, not with air, not with anything that could be measured or quantified, but with a pulse of existence itself. The fabric of space trembled, and for a moment Sharon wasn't certain if he was still standing on solid ground or floating in the abyss. His warriors tensed, weapons primed, but none of them fired. Not because they lacked the will, but because There was nothing to fire at, yet the human didn't move. He simply watched. "Step away from the anomaly," Sharon commanded, his voice sharp, clawed with authority. He needed control. His soldiers needed control. This was slipping too far into the unknown, and unknowns got people killed. The human didn't listen. Instead, he turned slightly, looking over his shoulder at the shifting, flickering horizon of the dead zone. His posture changed, still relaxed, but with an unmistakable anticipation. Karin's claws twitched. That was an order. The human exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You still think you're in charge of this situation?" The ground lurched. Not an earthquake. Those required tectonic activity, a planetary core, something rational. This was wrong. The terrain twisted beneath their feet, reality bending in ways that made Sharin's soldiers snap their mandibles in alarm. A warning. Light blinked on his visor display. Biofeedback instability detected, Vralik cursed. "Commander, we need to fall back." The sky changed. What had been an empty void, a lightless expanse stretching beyond the anomaly, now shifted. Stars bent at impossible angles. Darkness coiled like something alive. The event horizon of the dead zone rippled outward, and in that distortion something moved, a shape. No, a presence. It was watching them. Sharon felt something his species had long since evolved past. A primitive, ancient instinct buried beneath layers of training and discipline. Prey fear. His soldiers sensed it too. Vralik whispered, "Sir, what is that?" Sharin had no answer. The human did. His voice was quiet, but firm. "You shouldn't have come here." Sharin had enough. His mandibles flared wide. "What are we looking at, human?" The anomaly pulsed again. The thing beyond it stirred, responding to their presence. The human's expression hardened. "You think the dead zone is a place?" He shook his head slowly. "It's not." Sharin's claws dug into his rifle grip. "Then what is it?" The human's next words froze them all. "A wound." The anomaly shuddered. Not an external shift, but something deeper, internal, a convulsion in reality itself. And then, for a fraction of a second, Sharin saw. A glimpse, a truth so vast and incomprehensible, his mind rejected it outright. Not a place, not a thing. A living, broken, starving entity. And they were standing inside its open mouth. Alarms shrieked from their suits, biofeedback surging, neural connections overloading. Sharin stumbled back, breath ragged, vision doubling. His warriors were breaking. A formation faltering, something unheard of in the Dominion military. The human turned, finally stepping away from the anomaly. "Now you understand," he murmured. "Now you see why I said you should leave." Sharin fought to steady himself, claws clenching into fists. He wasn't ready to accept this. He couldn't. But the truth no longer cared about his acceptance. The dead zone was waking up, and it was hungry. The first scream came from the rear guard. Sharin barely had time to turn before one of his warriors vanished. No explosion, no impact, just gone. 1 second there, the next, erased. Panic rippled through the formation. Clawed feet scrambled against the unstable ground. Weapons were raised, but at what? There was nothing there, nothing visible, only the anomaly, only the wound. Vralik's voice was raw with disbelief. "Commander, we need to—" A shadow moved. No, absence. Tear in space itself, coiling through the air, impossibly thin but impossibly deep. Like a knife cutting through the fabric of reality. Sharin's instincts took over. "Fall back! Now!" His warriors didn't hesitate. Decades of training, genetic conditioning, it overpowered their fear just enough to move. They turned, retreating, in tight formation, keeping their weapons aimed at the shifting horizon. It didn't matter. The thing inside had already seen them. It didn't lunge, didn't strike like a predator. It pulled. The air itself seemed to drag them backward, toward the anomaly's yawning maw. The ground bent, stretching like liquid, warping under forces Charon couldn't comprehend. Then, another scream. Charon snapped his gaze left. His soldiers fought against the invisible pull, claws digging into the cracked terrain. His mandibles clicked, calling for help. Then his armor crumpled inward, not crushed, folded, his body twisted in ways that should not be possible, his form shrinking, compressing, and then, like the first warrior, gone, no remains, no blood, just absence. Charon's stomach lurched, his vision blurred at the edges, instinct screaming at him to run, but he forced himself to focus. There had to be a way out. Think. His eyes snapped to the human. The bastard was calm. The anomaly writhed behind him, the wound in space churning like something awakening. But the human just stood there, watching Charon and his dying squad like an observer rather than a participant. A single word left Charon's throat, more snarl than speech. How? The human sighed. I warned you. Charon leveled his rifle at him. If you know how to survive this, you will tell me. The human met his gaze. Not with defiance, not with mockery, with something worse. Pity. You still don't get it? His voice was almost gentle. You're trying to fight something that doesn't recognize you as real. The anomaly shuddered. Vralik let out a strangled noise, clawed hands gripping his skull. Sir, I can't. Charon's HUD flickered. His own name was distorting on the display, his rank, his identity. A realization struck like a plasma bolt to the chest. It wasn't just killing them, it was unmaking them, ripping their existence. Apart thread by thread, the way a mind forgets a fading dream. Charon refused. With a guttural snarl, he turned his weapon on the human. If you know a way out, he growled, you will take us. The human held his gaze, unafraid. Then finally, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for something at his belt. A small device, no larger than his palm. He tossed it to Charon, who caught it on instinct. The moment his claws closed around it, the world snapped, everything tilted, the pull reversed, and then light. A blinding, searing white engulfed Charon's vision. He felt the force of acceleration, a lurch deep in his gut, the unmistakable pressure of a gravitational shift. Then, impact. His body slammed against something solid. He rolled, skidding across a metal floor, the sound of klaxons shrieking in his ears. His ship. His warship. Charon's breath came ragged. His soldiers, what remained of them, were sprawled around him, gasping, clutching their weapons as if they still expected to be erased. The human stood a few feet away, unharmed, unbothered. Charon pushed himself up, panting. His claws dug into the deck plating. He was alive. He was still himself. His head snapped toward the viewport. The dead zone was gone. No, not gone, sealed. The anomaly had collapsed in on itself, leaving only empty space where the wound had once been. Charon turned back to the human, fury roaring through his veins. What did you do? The human met his gaze, unmoved. I let you leave. The silence on the warship's bridge was suffocating. Not the eerie, unnatural silence of the dead zone, but the kind that came after a battle no one had truly won. The kind that settled when warriors realized they had seen something that had changed them. Charon's breathing slowed, his three hearts pounding against his ribs, struggling to process what had just happened. His soldiers, what remained of them, stood in stunned disarray, gripping their weapons like lifelines, their eyes locked on the human standing so casually at the center of the room. Charon's mandibles clicked in restrained fury. He had lost warriors. His ship had nearly been compromised. His mind had come closer to unraveling than he dared admit, and this human, this impossible thing, had let him leave. He rose to his full height, his shadow stretching over the human, his presence radiating authority. Explain. The human met his gaze without fear. I already did. Charon's claws curled into fists. You think I'll accept that? His voice was a growl, low and threatening. You manipulated us, used us. You knew what that place was, yet you let us walk into it anyway. The human exhaled, as if exhausted by the conversation. And yet, here you are, still breathing. He gestured toward the viewport, where the anomaly had sealed itself shut, leaving nothing but empty void. Because of me. Sharon's mandibles clicked hard, frustration bubbling under his control. He hated it, hated how powerless this human had made him feel, how close he had come to ceasing to exist. He had seen empires crumble. He had led extermination campaigns. He had fought in wars that reshaped the stars themselves. And yet, for the first time, he had no idea what he had just survived. You called it a wound, Sharon muttered, voice edged with distrust. A wound in what? The human's expression turned unreadable. In reality, in time, in something bigger. He held Sharon's gaze. It was never meant to open. You're just lucky you weren't there when it did. A cold ripple ran through Sharon's body. Vralik finally found his voice, quieter, hesitant. Why were you there? The human didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the viewport, watching the emptiness where the anomaly had once been. Then he spoke. I was born in it. A ripple of unease passed through the warriors. Sharon didn't move. His grip tightened, claws flexing, but he forced himself to stay still. He had been played once today. He wouldn't let it happen again. You're lying, the human shrugged. Believe what you want. Sharon inhaled slowly, centering himself. He had no patience for riddles. Then tell me this, human. If the wound is sealed, why does it feel like this isn't over? A shadow passed over the human's face. Because it isn't. The ship's lights flickered just for a second, a glitch, a blink. Sharon's claws tensed. Every warrior on the bridge shifted, hands tightening around their weapons. The human finally turned back to face him fully. His voice was lower now, almost grim. You didn't escape the dead zone, Commander. Sharon's mandibles tightened. Then what did we do? The human's expression was not one of triumph, not amusement, something far worse. You woke it up. The warship drifted in silence, the vast void stretching endlessly beyond its reinforced hull. The anomaly was gone. The dead zone had collapsed in on itself, and yet every soldier on the bridge could feel it, a wrongness in the air, a weight pressing against their minds like an unfinished thought, a presence that should not exist, not anymore, not here. Charin stood motionless, claws clenched at his sides. His heart pounded an uneven rhythm, but his face betrayed nothing. They had survived. But at what cost? The human was still there, standing with that same infuriating calm, as if nothing had changed. But Jarin knew better. It had changed everything. Vralik took a cautious step forward. His voice was hoarse, raw from barely contained tension. Sir, I don't understand. If the dead zone is sealed, why do I still feel like it's... His mandibles clicked in hesitation. Like it's watching us. The human exhaled, shaking his head. Because you look too long. Sharon's claws curled against his palms. What does that mean? The human finally turned to face him. Fully. Nothing sees you until you see it first. That's how it works. That's how it always works. His gaze was steady, unreadable. And now that you've looked... He let the words hang in the air. Sharon refused to let the implication sink in. He refused to acknowledge the dread curling in his gut, the instinct screaming at him that they had made a mistake. Instead, he focused on control, order, logic. He had his ship, his warriors, his authority. The mission was over. And yet, Sharon's eyes flicked toward the viewport again, toward the void where the dead zone had once been. Had it moved? A cold whisper curled at the edges of his mind, distant and hollow. Not a voice, not a thought. A presence, a simple, undeniable truth settled into his bones. The dead zone wasn't gone. It had simply noticed them, and now it knew their names. Charin turned back to the human, jaw tightening. "You should be dead," the human smirked. "So, should you?" Silence. Then Charin did the only thing that made sense. He gave the order, "Get him off my ship." Two guards hesitated for half a second before stepping forward, weapons trained on the human. Not that it would make a difference. Charin had a feeling that if the human wanted to leave, no force in the galaxy would have stopped him. But the human didn't resist. He just let himself be led away, as if he already knew this was how it would end, or worse, as if it didn't matter. Charin watched him go, something bitter curling in his chest. He wanted to believe this was over, that they could return to the Dominion, report the anomaly destroyed, and pretend this had all been just another failed exploration mission. But deep down, he already knew the truth. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. The human left without protest. Charin watched as the guards led him through the reinforced corridor, the warship's internal lights flickering just for a moment as he passed. It wasn't a power fluctuation. It wasn't a malfunction. It was something else, something wrong. He exhaled slowly, trying to shake the feeling creeping up his spine. The anomaly was gone. The dead zone had collapsed. They had survived. So why did it feel like the battle had just begun? Vralik stood beside him, his mandibles tightening as he stared at the sealed bulkhead door. "Sir, what do we do now?" Charin didn't answer immediately. Protocol dictated that they should report back to the Dominion High Command, log their findings, declassify the sector as a no-fly zone, and submit a full threat assessment. But how did you classify something like this? How did you report an absence? How did you explain that something was missing, not just in space, not just in time, but in reality itself? Charin turned back toward the viewport, staring into the void. The anomaly was gone. There was no trace of it left. And yet, something in his gut told him it hadn't ended. It had simply moved, somewhere else, somewhere closer. Charin's claws curled against the railing. "We do nothing!" Vralik's mandibles twitched in disbelief. "Sir?" Charin's voice was low, firm, final. "We say nothing. We saw nothing." His eyes remained locked on the void outside. "And if anyone ever asks about the dead zone, again, we make sure they never ask twice." Vralik hesitated, then nodded grimly. "Understood." The bridge remained silent as the warship's engines powered up. They left the system without looking back, and deep in the shadows of space, where no light could reach, something watched them go, something awake, something waiting.